Let's get to this week's Spotlight on the Economy with NBR columnist John MacDermott. John, an interesting piece on inflation. I guess the question is, have central banks learnt any lessons from the United States in the late 70s and 80s?
Yeah, I thought it was time to look back in history. Some difficult times. We now have seen inflation globally at 6-7% in many countries, bit more in the US. What's it going to take to cure this problem? And the lessons are uncomfortable.
Yes, and is it a case of history repeating itself, and how high will interest rates need to go this time around?
Yeah, certainly we're getting echoes of the past. Yeah, and the thing is, like in the 70s and 80s, we've seen inflation start to sneak up. Everybody said, "Oh, it's not a big deal. It's going to be temporary. We don't have to worry about it." And then it gets too high, and it becomes a real burden for households. The cost of living is climbing rapidly. They need higher wages just to stay, where they were last year in terms of the cost of living. That puts costs for firms. They start to increase. They have to put up prices, and we get into this bit of cycle. So, what is it that we take to break it? And here's where the news is quite bad, because once you get into that mentality, the central bank has to put up interest rates. And the story I tell was one back in the very late 70s when Paul Volcker, who was known as a hero, that he did everything right. But actually, if you look in history, he had a really tough time. He was listening to former colleagues. They were saying it's impossible. We can't do it. He believed he could, but he had to have a secret meeting on a Saturday. Very unusual for central bankers. They got together on a Saturday. That caused some consternation among reporters. What is going on? Why are central bankers meeting on a Saturday? And so it famously became known as the Saturday Night Special, as he announced what was quite restrictive monetary policy to cure the inflation problem of the day.
And that's when he raised rates to 12%.
Yeah, that was the start of it. And he had to keep raising, and he was shocked about how far he had to raise, how long it took. And really, he started in late 97, and the battle wasn't fully won until mid to late 1982. That's a 3-year battle, which he had to undertake. And he wasn't well liked while he was doing it. It caused a lot of pain.
You mentioned in your article there were protests outside the Fed.
Yeah, business people, farmers, all kinds of protests, and some of them quite nasty, because it was a painful and difficult journey. I mean, the best lesson out of this, unfortunately, it's been lost. The best lesson is never let inflation escape. Don't let it get away, because the remedy is difficult. It will be a difficult journey for the Fed. It will be a difficult journey for our own Reserve Bank here in New Zealand. And they're going to have to take some very unpopular measures to fix the problem that they've let loose.
Well, we saw the Reserve Bank of Australia raise rates this week. The Reserve Bank expected to do the same next week. How high will it need to go?
Um, Look, so right now, central banks are having to balance the inflation problem. So a rough rule of thumb is, well, if inflation stayed at 7%, you'd need interest rates to get to that level. You need interest rates, less inflation to be positive. But people are starting to worry, well, maybe there's a bit of a slowdown in housing market. Maybe there's some weakness somewhere else in the economy, and things are already starting to come right. I think that's very optimistic.
Are we likely to see protests outside the Reserve Bank of New Zealand?
I certainly hope not. Um, but it does get difficult. Once the medicine becomes severe, people question why we're doing this. Is it really necessary? And look, if you start seeing firms laying off people, there will be some level of discomfort and maybe even protests. Who knows? But um, I think we're now starting to act, so that's important. We've let it get too far. We've reacted too slowly. The only saving grace is we're now reacting when inflation is 7%, and not when it's 10, 11%.
You briefly touch in the article about the R word recession. Tell me a little bit more about why you included that and whether it's a reality now.
And we're hearing that word across financial markets, media reports. People are starting to fear it. We're not there yet. There is a risk. It's just incredibly difficult to slow an economy to cure inflation in a nice, orderly fashion. That's an almost impossible task. And so usually what you get is you jam on the brakes, you throw the economy into recession. It cures the inflation problem, but it's a tough way to do it. Going to be hard to avoid the recession, but you never know. Maybe we're lucky this time.
Are the lights going to be on at the Reserve Bank this Saturday night?
I sort of mentioned that in jest as going back. I think central bankers have gone past the time when they need to meet during the weekends. But look, if things continue, who knows? But if you see them on a weekend, if you see the lights on, the Reserve Bank on a weekend, you know something big's happening.
John MacDermott, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.